A lot of major franchises in gaming will end up with some type of spin-off game or games, meant to bring a recognizable brand name into a new space or genre, whether it be an experiment, cash grab, or genuine attempt at trying something new. Halo Wars, Gears Tactics, Dead Space Extraction, any number of Pokemon spin-offs, these are all examples of games that share an IP with an existing franchise, but change up the gameplay formula. Going from a first-person shooter to a real-time strategy game or a third-person shooter to a tactical strategy game, for instance. The Assassin's Creed Chronicles trilogy is Ubisoft's attempt at this. The AC Chronicles trilogy consists of, wouldn't you know it, 3 games: Assassin's Creed Chronicles China, India, and Russia. Instead of the usual 3D open world you get in a typical AC game, the Chronicles games are 2.5D side-scrollers. I didn't really want to make an individual video for each game, so I'm going to be reviewing all 3 in this video. I played all 3 games on the Xbox One S on normal difficulty for one playthrough each. This video will contain spoilers. You have been warned. All 3 games have a unique art style distinct from each other, inspired by their setting. China looks like old Chinese paintings with dark inky blacks and brush strokes. India is vibrant and colorful, almost psychedelic, at least in the cutscenes. And Russia looks like a Soviet propaganda poster come to life, with mostly black, white, and reds in its color palette. The cutscenes showcase these art styles beautifully as well, with some pretty cool transitions, even if they are just basically still images with voiceover. Speaking of the voiceover, for some reason a lot of the voice actors are like quietly mumbling their lines, sometimes almost whispering them, and for whatever reason the voice audio level wasn't raised in the mix to account for this, meaning that without subtitles I wouldn't have been able to understand most of what the characters were saying. In fact, there are a few parts of the game where characters will speak during gameplay and subtitles don't show up, and I had no idea what they were saying. This is a pretty bizarre issue that I haven't encountered before in a game. There were also a couple instances of subtitles not matching what was said across all 3 games. The animations in the game were cool, stylish, and fluid like they are in the main games. The game makes use of its 2.5D nature by having depth and dimension within its 2D design. Many levels transition from the foreground to the background planes, and sometimes you can go around buildings and turn the world 90 degrees. It's a cool addition that gives the levels more depth in their design and presentation. The soundtracks for the games are fine. They're not bad, but other than some of the new takes on motifs from previous games, like each game's different versions of Ezio's family, there wasn't much that stood out to me. Each game's story revolves around a precursor box that was initially given to Xiao Jun by Ezio Auditore in the Embers animated short film, and last seen being taken from Arno's father by Shay Cormac in Assassin's Creed Rogue. Xiao Jun is the protagonist of China, Arbaz Mir is India's, and Nikolai Orlov is Russia's. China's story is the first chronologically, then India's, then Russia's. Now I gotta be honest, the stories in these games are pretty forgettable and uninteresting. I was pretty pumped to play as Xiao Jun in China because I liked her character in Embers, but her story is more or less just a revenge plot with a twist betrayal near the end of the game by a character that we have never met before, and the same thing happens in Russia as well. Oh no, this character who I don't know betrayed us. I don't really care. Side note, Xiao Jun's voice actor isn't the same one she had in Embers for some reason. India has kind of a different take on this, where Arbaz's love interest is introduced in the first level and taken hostage by the Templars at the end of the game, but those are literally the only 2 times we ever see her, so again, I still didn't care. Russia definitely had my favorite story out of the 3. It's not an amazing story or anything, it's kind of cliched, with Nikolai being that old guy who's doing one last mission then he's out for good, but ends up getting roped up in something that screws up his retirement plans. That something being saving Anastasia during the Russian Revolution and helping her escape the country. Like I said, the story still isn't that great, but at least I actually gave a bit of a shit about whether Nikolai and Anna were able to make it out. Russia also shows us a side of the assassins that we haven't really seen that much of, if at all, in the main games. Anastasia gets imprinted by the precursor box with Xiao Jun's personality, and the assassins were going to try and extract information about the precursors or something, a process that either kills the person being experimented on or leaves them in a vegetative state. That sure doesn't sound like not hurting innocent people, you know, one of the 3 rules your creed has. The precursor box is what's mostly responsible for connecting these stories, as it shows up in all 3, but it's not really anything more than a MacGuffin used to get some of these events in motion. The Chronicles games had their very nature going against them for me. I am not a big fan of side-scrollers, nor am I a fan of trial-and-error stealth games, and if I hadn't been doing this Assassin's Creed series retrospective thing, I don't think I would have ever played them. The Chronicles games aren't the first time Ubisoft attempted to translate the series into a side-scroller. However, their previous efforts were on handheld, and I happen to have one of those games right here. The Chronicles games weren't actually developed by Ubisoft, however. They were outsourced to Climax Studios, best known for their work on Crayola Scoot. Crayola Scoot. And I wouldn't be surprised if they drew some inspiration from this game. I've also seen people compare the Chronicles games to Mark of the Ninja, another side-scrolling stealth game, but I've never played it, so I can't comment on that. Each of the three pillars of the Assassin's Creed gameplay formula are present in the game: navigation, combat, and stealth to varying degrees of success. Firstly, the combat. It kinda sucks. You have a light attack, a heavy attack, you can roll over enemies, and you can block attacks. Light attacks are quick, but they can't actually kill enemies, so you need to finish them off with a heavy attack. The problem is the combat is really clunky and stilted and doesn't feel good at all. I mean, the main AC games have never had the best combat systems either, but the Chronicles games are even worse. Enemies kill you fast because you have a small amount of health and their attacks do a lot of damage. They also attack really quickly without much telegraphing, and while you can dodge bullets and block melee attacks, it's just so finicky that whenever I did end up in a combat situation, most of the time I would either just run away if I could or let myself die so I could try to stealth my way past again. Speaking of stealth, there's quite a bit to unpack here, more than I thought there would be. You have the expected ability to assassinate people in all manner of ways, like from ledges, from above, from hiding places, and of course, by just shanking them from behind. Once shanked, you can then pick up bodies and hide them in hiding places so other enemies don't find the body. You can also easily transition between hiding places, which is a pretty cool feature. Enemies all have vision cones, giving you a very clear indicator as to exactly where an enemy is looking and what state of alertness they currently are in. Enemies that are in conversation with each other will be oblivious to almost everything you do, so you can either sneak past them or try and take them both out at once with a multi-kill. Although the multi-kill is pretty inconsistent. There were quite a few times where I had the multi-kill option presented to me, but when I actually pressed the button to do it, I only killed one enemy, leading me to being killed. It definitely needed some more fine-tuning. There are noisy floors that need to be traversed by crouching, otherwise enemies will hear you coming. And there are other obstacles like wind chimes that will ding if you touch them, or animals in cages like birds or tigers that will make noise if you enter their field of view. But along with moving from cover to cover, you can also circumvent some of these obstacles by simply moving across the ceiling or ledges, or even going underneath them. You also have various tools and gadgets at your disposal to aid in your sneaky endeavors. All three games allow you to whisper to lure enemies to your location. In China, you have firecrackers that can stun enemies, throwing knives to cut ropes with, and noise darts to lure enemies away from you. In India, you have chakrams, which act like throwing knives, except you can bounce them off of surfaces, and the smoke bombs, which carry over to Russia. And finally, Russia introduces the rifle and the winch, which is used to great effect to disarm traps and move objects. I was also very impressed by the amount of new stuff added from game to game. By the end of China, you have a pretty substantial array of moves and mechanics you can use, and I was wondering whether India would build upon them or start over. But not only does India continue where China left off, for the most part, it also adds a ton of new mechanics and ideas to the game. You can roll after landing, you can dash to and away from enemies, you can more easily exit cover and hiding spots, you can multi-kill, you can pickpocket and loot guards, you can lockpick doors, and India even adds sniper sections which carry over to Russia, which again adds even more stuff to the formula. And there's a hefty amount of things to do as well in these games. Once you beat each game for the first time, you unlock both New Game Plus and New Game Plus Hard Mode, which carries over your unlocked abilities while also adding new things that you can only unlock in these modes. Each game has their own version of the Animus database from the main games, and India and Russia both have 3 different types of challenge levels: collection, contracts, and assassination. So even though each game is roughly 5 to 6 hours long, there isn't a lack of content here. The movement mechanics were definitely my favorite part of the games. Running and sliding and jumping and rolling and climbing my way through the levels just felt fluid and flowed very well, when I wasn't constantly having to stop to assess a new situation to deal with. There are a few levels in each game, however, that are timed, and the goal is to just make it to the end of the level as fast as possible, and usually these sections are all about the movement, letting you slide jump or kill jump any enemies in your way without worrying about being stealthy. These levels were absolutely my favorite part of each game. Well, at least the first two. Which brings me to Russia. Russia has my favorite story, my favorite art style, and some of my favorite mechanics out of the 3 games. So why is it without a doubt my least favorite game of the 3? Well, it's because of one word: bullshit. Now remember earlier when I said that I do not like trial and error stealth games? China is probably the least trial and error-y out of the 3, then India, then Russia. However, there's a difference between trial and error gameplay and gameplay that is unnecessarily difficult and unforgiving. India had a few moments where the gameplay veered into bullshit territory, where the game would punish you if you messed up at all, no matter how small the mistake was, and some of the scenarios you were presented with relied way too heavily on trying over and over again to figure them out. But for the most part, India wasn't too bad when it came to this kind of thing. Russia, on the other hand, said Leroy Jenkins and jumped headfirst into complete and utter bullshittery. The difficulty spike between India and Russia was so dramatic and noticeable that I was honestly like freaking out a little bit, thinking that maybe I had somehow just gotten totally shit at these games, or I had just never noticed how hard the previous games were for some reason. But no, I actually Googled it, and every article I could find said the same thing I was thinking. The difficulty in Russia was so much more unforgiving that I actually gaslighted myself because of it. Now listen, I don't have a problem with hard games. I don't go out of my way to play hard games just because they're difficult, but I do occasionally dip my toes into playing games on harder difficulties. For instance, I beat Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal on Ultraviolence when I reviewed them, and I beat the first Last of Us on Survivor also when I was reviewing it, and I beat Cuphead without dying once. Okay, that last one was a joke, but the point is I don't mind playing difficult games as long as it feels like the difficulty is fair. For example, when I played both the Doom games and the Last of Us on their harder difficulty settings and even the previous 2 Chronicles games, most of the time whenever I died I felt like my deaths were my fault, that I had made a mistake, chosen the wrong move to make, and as a result I was punished. But in Russia it was the exact opposite. Most of the time whenever I died in Russia it either wasn't really my fault or there was no reasonable way for me to know what to do to get past whatever situation I was presented with. In fact, Russia doesn't really even feel like a trial and error stealth game most of the time. It feels more like a puzzle game pretending to be a stealth game, except it's fucking hard as shit. Imagine playing a puzzle game like Portal 2, only every time you make even a small mistake while trying to solve a puzzle, you're killed instantly and have to restart the whole puzzle over. That's how Russia is, and it became incredibly unfun and frustrating long before I finished it. Another thing that makes Russia much more frustrating than the first 2 games is the upgrading system. Each game grades you based on how well you do for each section of the level out of 3 categories: Shadow, Silencer, and Assassin. All it really boils down to is how many times you're seen or guards are alerted to your presence and how many enemies you kill. The highest score would be awarded for not killing anyone and not alerting any guards to your presence. Each of these categories are broken down into 3 more grades: Bronze, Silver, and Gold. Each time you get Gold, it adds a multiplier to your score up to a maximum of 5, but if you get Silver or Bronze, your multiplier goes back to 0. You can also get bonus points by collecting or accomplishing any secondary objectives in the level. There are 2 possible upgrades you can obtain per level depending on whether your score is high enough. Now for all 3 games I got a majority of gold ratings for most parts of each level, and in China and India I had managed to get most of the upgrades possible for a first playthrough. But in Russia I was only able to get 4 upgrades in the entire game, despite still getting mostly gold, same as I did in the first 2 games. I don't know if the scores for getting the upgrades in Russia are too high or if the game expects you to beat every part of every level perfectly, but all this resulted in was making an already bullshit hard game even less forgiving. Russia also has the only glitch I encountered across all 3 games. I transitioned to another part of the level but couldn't move or do anything at all. There was also a point in the game where the loading times increased significantly compared to the rest of the game beforehand and remained longer until the end of the game. I initially thought it was a glitch, so I restarted the game, but the problem persisted. So I then restarted my Xbox, but it still happened after that, so I don't know what happened. Russia is obviously the worst of the three, but I still don't think that China or India are that great either. All three games have great visual presentation, but there's some odd issues with the audio side of things, and all three stories aren't very good either. And while the stealth part of these games is deeper than it has any right to be, I just didn't enjoy the trial and error nature of it that much, even in China, the least bullshitty of the three. The combat sucks as well, and even though I did really like the movement mechanics, that isn't enough to save these games for me. I don't really like these three games, and I don't think I'm alone in saying that. Prior to beginning this review, I expected to find at least some people saying that these games were their favorite of the series because they were so different from the rest of the main titles. But I couldn't actually find anyone saying that. The biggest sentiment I did find in regards to these games was disappointment that Ubisoft chose to explore each of these settings and spin-offs rather than proper main entries in the series. I don't really know who I would recommend these games to since I didn't like them, and Assassin's Creed fans didn't seem to like them that much either. If you are a fan of the AC franchise and you've never played these games before, well, I would say if anything I've said in this video has piqued your interest, wait for a sale, and if you can't get the trilogy version, only buy one of them first and see if you like it, because I guarantee that if you don't like the first game, you won't like the other two. I am never going to play these games again. I'm going to give Assassin's Creed Chronicles China a 6 out of 10, India a 6 out of 10, and Russia a 5 out of 10. I am so glad to not have to play these games again. I found them a real struggle to get through, especially Russia. Seriously, fuck that game, man. The next review is either going to be for the second Doom Eternal DLC, The Ancient Gods Part 2, or if I decide not to do a video on it, the next review will be Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I also want to try out different kinds of videos on my channel, which you might see sooner rather than later. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and commenting your thoughts on the Chronicles trilogy below. Thanks for watching.